The morning sun was already climbing over the Pacific when Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, watching the organized madness below him unfold like some kind of mechanical ballet gone wrong. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. They'd been trembling ever since he'd gotten back from dropping bombs on Midway, and now here he was, clutching his flight roster while trying to make sense of what he was seeing down there on that deck. Type 99 dive bombers getting pushed to one side. Type 97 torpedo planes having their deadly fish swapped out for massive 800-kilogram bombs. Fuel lines stretched across the deck like somebody had thrown a bunch of metal snakes everywhere. The date was June 4th, 1942, and the time read 10:22 in the morning. They were floating 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll, and Tomonaga had a letter stuffed in his pocket that he'd been writing to his wife. The last thing he'd written before stopping was that the Americans were nowhere to be found, and victory was absolutely certain. Poor bastard had no way of knowing that American aircraft were already heading straight toward his exact position at that very moment. He couldn't have guessed that the next 11 minutes would decide the fate not just of 4 Japanese carriers, but the entire direction the Pacific War would take. There was absolutely no way for him to understand that everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about how to fight with carriers, what the Americans were capable of, and their own sense of being unbeatable was about to get completely shattered in less time than it takes to finish drinking a cup of tea. Down on that flight deck, one level below where Tomonaga stood watching, an aircraft mechanic named Kaname Harada was working with the kind of desperate speed that comes from knowing something's wrong but not being able to say what. He held the rank of Petty Officer First Class, and he was supervising the weapons changeover that Admiral Nagumo had ordered just a few minutes earlier. They drilled for exactly this scenario, switching from land attack weapons to ship attack weapons, but never under this kind of pressure. Never with scouts radioing back information that didn't quite add up, never with this strange feeling in his gut that told him something was terribly wrong despite every piece of evidence pointing to Japanese superiority. At 10:20 that morning, the Japanese carriers had been absolute masters of the Pacific, their aircraft getting ready to destroy what they thought was just one lone American carrier somewhere in the area. By 10:31, 3 of those 4 carriers would be dying, turned into burning steel coffins by American dive bombers that seemed to just appear out of empty sky like some kind of terrible magic trick. Those 11 minutes would expose truths about modern naval warfare that neither navy really understood until they watched it all happen in real time over that endless blue Pacific canvas. When you looked at the numbers on paper that morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese naval superiority seemed absolutely impossible to argue with. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded something called the Kido Butai, which was simply the most powerful carrier striking force that had ever been put together in the history of naval warfare. 4 fleet carriers sailing together: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu. A total of 248 aircraft, manned by what were genuinely the most experienced naval aviators anywhere in the world. These weren't rookies. These were veterans who'd bombed Pearl Harbor, raided throughout the Indian Ocean, hit Darwin and Ceylon. These were men who had sunk more Allied warships in just 6 months than the entire Imperial Navy had managed to destroy in all of Japan's previous wars combined. Facing them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. That last one was particularly interesting because Yorktown should have been in dry dock for at least 3 months, getting repaired from damage she'd taken in an earlier battle. Instead, 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor had somehow made her barely seaworthy in just 72 hours, which was frankly insane. The Americans had 233 aircraft total, and most of them were being flown by pilots who'd never even seen combat before. Many had logged less than 300 hours total flight time. The torpedo bomber squadrons were stuck flying the TBD Devastator, an aircraft so hopelessly obsolete that the pilots themselves had taken to calling it the TB Dead, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about their confidence in the machine. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi had been feeling supremely confident about the whole situation. He'd written in his war diary that the American Navy was a broken force and that after today they wouldn't have any carriers left in the Pacific at all. The war would effectively be over. This wasn't just empty bragging on his part. The Japanese had won literally every carrier engagement of the war so far. At the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month before, which had been the first carrier versus carrier battle in all of history, they'd managed to sink the USS Lexington, which was America's second largest carrier, while only losing the light carrier Shoho themselves. They'd raided Darwin and nobody stopped them. They'd struck Ceylon and faced no real opposition. They'd operated freely from Hawaii all the way to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese didn't know on that particular morning would have filled entire volumes of books. They had no idea that American cryptanalysts working at a place called Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken their JN-25 naval code. They didn't know Admiral Nimitz had actually read their operation orders and knew their target was Midway and knew the composition of their force and had positioned his carriers specifically to ambush them. They didn't know that the Americans had been reading their mail for weeks. Commander Minoru Genda, who was the tactical genius that had actually planned the Pearl Harbor attack, was lying sick in his cabin aboard the Akagi with pneumonia. His absence from the bridge was going to prove absolutely critical because Genda alone among all the Japanese commanders had been pushing for keeping a permanent reserve of aircraft armed specifically for anti-ship operations at all times. His substitute was a man named Commander Tamotsu Oishi, who lacked both Genda's tactical intuition and his paranoia about American carriers showing up unexpectedly. The Japanese also had no clue that Yorktown was even operational. Their naval intelligence had confirmed she'd been heavily damaged at Coral Sea, which was completely true. They estimated 3 months minimum for repairs, which would have been true for any Japanese shipyard operating under normal procedures. What they couldn't even conceive of was that American workers at Pearl Harbor had somehow performed 3 months' worth of repairs in just 3 days, that welders had literally worked continuously while the ship was already underway, that her elevators had been fixed while she was sailing toward Midway. At 4:30 that morning on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had launched 7 scout planes to search for American ships. This was already a compromise from what their doctrine actually called for. Proper procedure required dozens of scouts fanning out in all directions, but Nagumo wanted to preserve as many aircraft as possible for the strike on Midway itself. Each scout would fly a single search line out 300 miles and then turn around and come back, which left absolutely vast areas of ocean completely unsearched. The most critical search line, designated as number 4 and launched from the cruiser Tone, ended up launching 30 minutes late because of catapult problems. This single mechanical failure, this one broken piece of equipment, would put Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at the absolute worst possible moment for the Japanese, right when their decks were completely crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. A scout plane observer named Amari, who was Petty Officer First Class from the battleship Haruna, testified later about what happened. He said they flew their assigned search line and saw nothing but empty ocean. He explained that they were trained to see what they expected to see, things like merchant ships or maybe a cruiser. Nobody was actively looking for American carriers because nobody actually believed American carriers were anywhere in the area. At 4:30 in the morning, while it was still dark, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike on Midway. 36 Zero fighters, 36 Valdive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led that strike, his aircraft carrying the radio that would soon transmit the message that would trigger an entire chain of fatal decisions. The Midway strike force ran into fierce resistance when they arrived. American fighters were waiting at altitude because radar had warned them the Japanese were coming. The fighters were obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, but they fought hard. Anti-aircraft fire was both intense and accurate. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft outright and had 14 more heavily damaged. More importantly than the losses, though, Tomonaga sent a radio message at 7 in the morning saying there was a need for a second attack wave on Midway. This message arrived just as Admiral Nagumo was making what would turn out to be the most crucial decision of his entire career. He'd been holding 93 aircraft in reserve, torpedo planes that were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically designed for attacking ships. American B-17 bombers from Midway were bombing his fleet from high altitude right at that moment. The bombing was ineffective, but it was forcing his ships to make evasive maneuvers. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just finished attacking, also ineffectively, but they demonstrated that Midway still had offensive capability and could keep attacking. Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued strongly for maintaining the anti-ship armament on the reserve aircraft. He told Nagumo they should keep the reserve armed for ship attack, and that just because they'd heard nothing from their scouts didn't mean there weren't any American ships out there somewhere. But Nagumo was under pressure from all these attacks happening and was influenced heavily by Tomonaga's message about needing a second wave on Midway, so at 7:15 in the morning he made his fateful decision. Remove the torpedoes and load bombs for land attack instead. What followed was controlled chaos that would ultimately prove fatal to the entire Japanese carrier force. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber could carry either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800-kilogram land attack bomb, but switching between them was incredibly complicated. You had to roll the aircraft down to the hangar deck using the elevator, remove the torpedo using these special carriages, mount the bomb using completely different attachment points, adjust the release mechanism because the ballistics were different, return the aircraft back up to the flight deck, and refuel it for a completely different mission profile. An aviation ordnance man second class named Takeshi Maeda, who was working on the Kaga, described the scene later. He said they worked like demons. The torpedoes were getting stacked on the hangar deck because returning them all the way down to the magazine took way too long. Fuel hoses were everywhere. They were actually refueling aircraft while simultaneously changing weapons, which was something that was strictly forbidden under normal circumstances, but absolutely necessary if they wanted to save time. The hangar deck had basically become a bomb with a lit fuse, but nobody was thinking about that. They'd done this exact drill hundreds of times before in training. On the Akagi, the situation was even more complex than on the other carriers. The ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could carry either 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs or 242-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs. The semi-armor-piercing ones were specifically for attacking ships, and the general-purpose ones were for land targets. The crews had to not only change out the actual bombs, but change the bomb types entirely, each one requiring different fuses and completely different mounting brackets. At 7:28 in the morning, while all this frantic rearming work was continuing down below, Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its designated turn point way out over the ocean. The pilot was Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari, and he was just about to turn back when he happened to spot white wakes on the horizon. His radioed report was frustratingly vague. He said he could see what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships at bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo received this message at 7:40 in the morning. 10 ships could mean literally anything. Could be destroyers, could be transports, could be cruisers. Nothing that required the urgent attention of his entire carrier force. He continued the rearming operation for land attack while ordering the scout to figure out what types of ships they were and maintain contact with them. At 7:55 in the morning, Nagumo got another message that gave him some relief. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded through the bridge when they heard that. Cruisers and destroyers meant no carriers. The rearming could continue as planned. Some officers actually started celebrating because catching an American surface force that didn't have any air cover would be excellent hunting. But then, at 8:09 in the morning, another message came through, this one correcting the previous report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The bridge of the Akagi erupted in what you might call controlled panic. One carrier, even just one carrier, changed absolutely everything about the tactical situation. Within seconds, Nagumo was issuing new orders. Suspend the rearming operation. Leave torpedoes on any aircraft that still have them attached. Prepare to launch a ship attack immediately. But the situation down below decks had already passed the point of no return. Half the aircraft had bombs attached, but the bombs weren't fused yet. Other aircraft had torpedoes that were only partially mounted. Some aircraft were up on the flight deck with bombs, while others were down in the hangar with torpedoes. To launch any kind of coordinated strike, all the aircraft needed to be armed exactly the same way. They needed at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion or go back to torpedoes. The situation was actually even worse than anyone on the bridge understood at that moment. The returning Midway strike force was approaching the carriers right then, many aircraft low on fuel, some badly damaged, all of them needing to land immediately. Navy doctrine was absolutely clear about this. You recovered your aircraft first, then you launched new strikes afterward. To do anything else would mean losing dozens of aircraft and, more critically, losing their veteran pilots. At 8:30 in the morning, Nagumo made his second fatal decision of the day. Recover the Midway strike force first, then we'll deal with the American carrier. From 8:37 in the morning until 9:17, all 4 Japanese carriers focused entirely on recovering the Midway strike force. This operation was complex, even under ideal circumstances. You had to clear the flight deck of all parked aircraft, turn the ship into the wind, recover aircraft in a specific sequence with damaged aircraft landing first, then fighters with the lowest fuel, then bombers. You had to strike the recovered aircraft below immediately to clear deck space, refuel and rearm the recovered aircraft, then spot new aircraft for launch. What the Japanese absolutely did not know was that time had already completely run out for them. At 7:02 that morning, Admiral Spruance on the Enterprise had made what would turn out to be the most important decision of his entire career. He ordered launch everything immediately at maximum range without waiting to coordinate a proper strike. His Air Operations Officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had actually protested this decision. He told the Admiral they'd be launching at extreme range and many planes wouldn't make it back. Spruance's reply ended up being prophetic. He said they might lose planes, but if they caught the Japanese recovering their Midway strike force, they'd catch them at their most vulnerable moment. The American carrier launch that happened between 7:02 and 8:00 that morning was barely controlled chaos that would have absolutely appalled any Japanese naval aviation instructor. Instead of launching a properly coordinated strike package with fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers all arriving simultaneously at the target, each American squadron launched as soon as it was ready and then proceeded independently toward where they thought the Japanese carriers would be. From Enterprise, they launched 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet, they launched 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, which was launching 2 hours later than the others, they sent up 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a complete disaster by Japanese standards. Different squadrons became separated from each other. Fighters were flying at completely different altitudes from the bombers. Radio discipline collapsed entirely. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons flying in completely wrong directions. The fighters and dive bombers from Hornet never even found the Japanese fleet at all. They ran out of fuel and either ditched in the ocean or returned to base having accomplished absolutely nothing. Ensign George Gay, who was a torpedo bomber pilot from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, described the scene later. He said they launched knowing they probably wouldn't make it back to the carrier. Their squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, had told them straight up that they were going alone. They'd probably all be killed, but we're going to hit those carriers no matter what. They flew off separately from their own fighters and dive bombers. It was suicide, but it was also their job. At 9:18 in the morning, Just as the very last Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike was landing on the carriers, radar on the Soryu detected incoming aircraft flying low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron had found the Japanese fleet through a combination of brilliant navigation and sheer determination. 15 obsolete torpedo bombers without any fighter escort were about to attack the most powerful carrier force in the world. The massacre was absolutely complete. All 15 TBD devastators were shot down. 29 of the 30 air crew were killed. Only Ensign Gay survived, and he did it by hiding under his seat cushion floating in the water, watching what came next. Not a single torpedo hit any Japanese ship. The attack seemed completely futile and pointless, but the sacrifice had actually achieved something absolutely crucial. The Japanese Zero fighters had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced into wild evasive maneuvers and were unable to spot any aircraft for launch. Most critically, the attention of every Japanese lookout and fighter director was focused down at sea level where the torpedo bombers were dying. At 9:36 in the morning, VT-6 from Enterprise arrived with 14 more torpedo bombers, also without any escort. They were massacred exactly like the first squadron had been, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single hit. At 10 o'clock, Yorktown's VT-3 showed up with 12 more torpedo bombers and a handful of fighters providing some cover. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft and again scored absolutely no hits. By 10:20 in the morning, the last of the American torpedo bombers was either destroyed or fleeing the area. The Japanese carriers started recovering their Zeros, which were now running low on ammunition and fuel from all that slaughter they'd been doing. Victory seemed absolutely complete. Not a single torpedo had managed to hit anything, and 35 of the 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally allowed himself to relax a bit. His operations officer reported that they could be ready to launch their strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes, with all aircraft properly armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were absolutely packed with aircraft at that moment. The Akagi had 40 aircraft sitting on deck, all of them fueled and armed and ready to go. The Kaga had 30 aircraft on deck. The Soryu had 33. The Hiryu, which was sailing further north than the other 3, had 38 aircraft spotted on deck. Fuel hoses were still physically connected to aircraft. Ordnance crews were making final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mountings. Pilots were already in their cockpits with engines warming up and getting ready for launch. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying around in circles searching for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it was supposed to be according to the navigation calculations. Running low on fuel, McCluskey had made an educated guess. He decided to follow a Japanese destroyer he'd spotted racing northeast at high speed. That guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their single most vulnerable moment. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives from 14,500 feet altitude. The Zero fighters were all down at sea level, refueling and rearming. The anti-aircraft guns were all trained horizontally for defense against torpedo attacks. The decks were absolutely covered with aircraft and fuel lines and ordnance. Lieutenant Richard Best, who was leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his specific target. At almost exactly the same moment, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron was diving on the Kaga. 4 bombs hit that massive carrier in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb hit forward and destroyed the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his entire command staff instantly. The subsequent bombs hit among all those packed aircraft sitting on the deck. The resulting explosions were absolutely catastrophic. The torpedoes and bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against all safety regulations right there in the hangar started exploding in sequence. Within minutes, the ship was a complete inferno from bow to stern. The heat was so incredibly intense that firefighting crews couldn't even get within 50 feet of the flames without being driven back. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost the exact same moment as the others, targeting the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line running down the length of the flight deck. The first bomb exploded in the forward hangar bay. The second hit amidships right among all the packed aircraft. The third bomb destroyed the rear elevator completely. The Soryu had a particular vulnerability that the other carriers didn't have. She carried extra aviation fuel stored in tanks along the sides of the hangar deck to extend the range her aircraft could fly. These fuel tanks ruptured immediately when the bombs hit, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At 10:31 in the morning, as suddenly as the American attack had begun, it was over. McCluskey's dive bombers were heading back toward their carriers, many of them running on absolute fumes in their fuel tanks. In just 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat anywhere in the world into burning hulks that were already dying. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in complete shock on the bridge as explosions continued to rock the ship beneath his feet. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed absolutely impossible to believe. Flight deck completely destroyed. Hangar deck engulfed in flames. All aircraft lost. Steering control lost. Communications destroyed. Captain Taijiro Aoki physically grabbed Nagumo, who seemed completely paralyzed and unable to process what was happening. He told the admiral they had to transfer his flag to another ship because the Akagi was lost. On the Kaga, the situation was even worse than on the Akagi. With the captain and all the senior officers killed in that first bomb hit, command had devolved to the damage control officer, who was now trapped below decks by fire. The Soryu was dying the fastest of the 3 burning carriers. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge even as flames were approaching his position. His final order, which was heard by several survivors, was to save yourselves while he remained with Soryu. He was last seen lashing himself to the ship's helm, absolutely determined to go down with his ship. In the minutes immediately following 10:31 that morning, the Japanese Navy faced something they had absolutely no doctrine or experience to handle. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been eliminated in less time than it took to conduct a single routine landing operation. On the Hiryu, which was the only surviving carrier, Admiral Taemun Yamaguchi watched in absolute horror as massive smoke columns rose from his 3 sister ships on the horizon. The mathematics of what had just happened were absolutely devastating. In 11 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft that had been sitting on the decks, another 40-plus aircraft that had been down in the hangars, another 50-plus aircraft that were aloft with literally nowhere to land now, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel. The scene aboard the burning carriers was beyond any ability to describe adequately. On the Akagi, secondary explosions kept happening for hours afterward. Each explosion would send sheets of steel flying like scythes through compartments that were packed with men trying to fight fires or escape. The hangar deck became nothing more than a crematorium. On the Kaga, the ship's enormous size, she'd been converted from a battleship hull, meant more compartments and more men trapped. The fires raging above made any kind of rescue completely impossible. The bulkheads got so hot they were literally glowing red. Hundreds of men died trapped in steel compartments that had turned into ovens. The Soryu's chief engineer, a man named Commander Kondo, survived long enough to describe what happened in the engine rooms. He said the first bomb had severed the steam lines and superheated steam at 400 degrees had filled the compartments instantly. Men were literally steamed alive in seconds. Others suffocated as the fires consumed every bit of oxygen in sealed spaces. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu faced an absolutely impossible situation but responded with characteristic aggression. Despite having only 1 carrier against what he knew were 3 American carriers somewhere out there, he immediately ordered a counterstrike without any hesitation. At 10:58 in the morning, just 27 minutes after the American attack had ended, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. This strike force found Yorktown at noon. Despite facing prepared defenses and radar-directed fighter interception, the veteran Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with complete determination. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, starting serious fires and damaging her boilers badly enough that the American carrier slowed to a complete stop. Yamaguchi didn't waste any time. He immediately ordered a second strike prepared and launched. At 1:31 in the afternoon, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros launched from Hiryu. This tiny force found Yorktown again at 2:42 in the afternoon. Despite absolutely intense anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half the attackers before they could even drop, the survivors managed to put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same man who had led the morning strike on Midway, led this torpedo attack even though his plane had been damaged over Midway earlier and his left-wing fuel tank had a hole in it. He knew perfectly well he didn't have enough fuel to make it back to the carrier, but he launched anyway because the mission required it. His torpedo was one of the 2 that hit Yorktown. His plane crashed into the sea immediately after the attack run, having completely run out of fuel. At 5:03 in the afternoon, the inevitable finally occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, which had launched her planes before being hit, found Hiryu sailing alone. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into yet another inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, who was mortally wounded in the attack, managed to give one last order before dying: scuttle the ship and save the crew. Admiral Yamaguchi made the deliberate choice to remain aboard the dying carrier. His final message to his staff was that he would apologize to the Emperor for the defeat and that they needed to go rebuild the navy. As all the Japanese carriers burned and died, the surviving officers were beginning to understand just how massive their intelligence failure had actually been. The evidence was completely overwhelming when you looked back at it. American carriers positioned at precisely the right location. Midway fully alerted and prepared for attack. Submarines positioned along the Japanese approach routes. Strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the right time to catch them vulnerable. It all added up to one unavoidable conclusion. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, who was the operations officer of the combined fleet, wrote later about this realization. He said they'd figured out that the Americans had been reading their mail the whole time. Every message, every order, every plan had been compromised. They'd been performing for an audience that already knew the entire script. The surprise they thought they possessed had actually belonged to the enemy all along. Beyond the intelligence failure, the battle had revealed fundamental truths about carrier warfare that the Japanese simply had not understood before. Their entire doctrine about massed carrier operations, coordinated strikes, holding reserves, all of it had actually been correct. But they had completely failed to execute that doctrine under pressure when it mattered. The American dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, had proved itself superior to the supposedly superior Japanese Val in the only metric that actually mattered in combat, which was survivability while delivering ordnance on target. The American doctrine of keeping aircraft spotted on deck ready to launch rather than storing them in hangars meant they could launch strikes much faster than the Japanese could. The American damage control procedures, which the Japanese had actually mocked as being overcautious and wasteful, had already saved Yorktown once at Coral Sea and would save many other American carriers throughout the entire war. As night fell over the Pacific on June 4th, thousands of Japanese sailors were floating in the water or crowded aboard destroyers that had picked them up. The 3 carriers that had been hit in those 11 minutes were still technically afloat, but they were just burning abandoned hulks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors actually refused rescue because they believed they had failed the Emperor and didn't deserve to live. Men would literally swim away from rescue lines while shouting that the Emperor should live 10,000 years, and then they'd dive underwater and hold their breath until they drowned rather than accept rescue. What the Japanese didn't know at that point was that the Americans actually believed they were losing even while they were winning. Admiral Spruance was receiving reports about all his missing squadrons, and when he did the calculations, he figured he'd lost over half his total aircraft. Yorktown was crippled and listing badly. Japanese submarines were being reported everywhere. Spruance's decision to continue the engagement despite all this uncertainty would prove absolutely crucial to the final outcome. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that evening, confirming just how massive the victory actually was. But even then, the Americans didn't fully understand what they had actually achieved. June 5th brought cruel confirmation of both American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine I-168, which had been dispatched by Yamamoto specifically to find damaged American ships, located Yorktown under tow and barely moving. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes at the slow-moving target. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown and 1 hit the destroyer Hammond that was sailing alongside providing support. Yorktown would finally sink on June 7th, becoming the last carrier lost at Midway. But by that point, the outcome had already been completely decided. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, scuttled by their own destroyers when it became absolutely clear they couldn't possibly be saved. The human cost of those 11 minutes just kept mounting for days afterward. The Akagi was scuttled at 5 in the morning on June 5th after burning continuously for 19 hours. The Kaga sank at 7:25 in the evening on June 4th, taking 811 men down with her. The Soryu went under at 7:13 in the evening on June 4th, with 711 souls still aboard. The Hiryu lingered until 9 in the morning on June 5th, before finally disappearing beneath the waves. The total Japanese death toll just from the 4 carriers was 2,181 men. But these weren't just ordinary sailors. These were the experienced mechanics who knew how to service incredibly complex aircraft engines. These were the armourers who could mount torpedoes in just minutes. These were the fuel handlers who could conduct underway replenishment operations. These were the veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific Ocean in just 6 months. You couldn't replace men like that. Admiral Yamamoto was aboard the battleship Yamato about 300 miles behind where the carrier force had been operating. He received the damage reports in complete silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described what happened on that bridge. He said the admiral sat completely motionless for nearly an hour after learning that the 4th carrier had been lost. Then Yamamoto said very quietly that the war was over. They would keep fighting, but the war was fundamentally over. Yamamoto understood something that would take others many months to fully grasp. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers total. In just 6 months of fighting, they had lost 5 of them. They could build new carriers, and they absolutely would build them, but they couldn't possibly replace the trained crews that had been lost. A properly trained carrier pilot required 2 full years of training from start to finish. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months of intensive training. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of constant drilling to operate with any kind of efficiency. The mathematics were absolutely inexorable and pointed in only one direction. America would launch 17 new carriers by the time Japan managed to commission just 1 replacement. American pilot training programs were already producing 10,000 pilots every single month by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 pilots per month and simply could not replace their losses. The survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that affected the entire Japanese Navy for the rest of the war. The myth of invincibility had been completely shattered. The confidence that had driven operations all the way from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated entirely in those 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted a whole bunch of new procedures based on the lessons from Midway. Combat air patrol had to be retained at altitude at all times. Decks had to be kept clear unless aircraft were immediately launching. Ordnance had to be returned to magazines immediately rather than stacking it on deck. Multiple overlapping search patterns were required. Radio silence was abandoned in favor of better tactical communication. But all these changes came way too late, and they addressed the symptoms rather than the actual underlying cause. The real cause was that American intelligence gathering, industrial production, and tactical innovation had already surpassed Japan, and the gap was only going to get wider. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created a completely different kind of transformation. They went from being desperate defenders to confident aggressors almost overnight. The Pacific Fleet, which had been absolutely traumatized by what happened at Pearl Harbor, had discovered they could not just fight the Japanese Navy, but actually destroy it when conditions were right. Admiral Nimitz received confirmation of the victory and told his staff something very simple. They are not supermen. They can be beaten. They have been beaten. Now we take the offensive. The tactical lessons got incorporated into American doctrine immediately. Dive bombers were the supreme ship killers, and nothing else came close. Coordinated strikes were ideal, but absolutely not essential to success. First strike advantage was completely decisive in carrier warfare. Radar-directed fighter control was absolutely crucial. Damage control procedures could save ships that seemed completely doomed. But the most important lesson was actually psychological rather than tactical. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, put it about as simply as anyone could. He said they had stood up to the absolute best the Japanese had and destroyed it completely. After seeing that happen, everyone knew they would win the war eventually. It was just going to be a matter of time and blood. Post-war analysis revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in absolutely devastating detail for the Japanese. The American dive bombers had caught the Japanese carriers in what naval theorists now call the vulnerable window, that specific moment when a carrier is at its most helpless. Aircraft being serviced on deck, preventing any defensive maneuvers. Fuel lines physically connected, making fire absolutely inevitable once started. Ordnance exposed on deck, multiplying the damage from any hit. Attention focused elsewhere, preventing early detection of incoming threats. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence officer whose codebreakers had made the entire ambush possible in the first place, observed something important about timing. He said they won because they knew exactly when the Japanese would be vulnerable, and they got lucky enough to catch them at precisely that moment. 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, and the entire battle ends completely differently. Today, the wrecks of those Japanese carriers lie in the deep waters off Midway, serving as war graves for thousands of men. Oceanographer Robert Ballard led expeditions that found Yorktown at 16,650 feet depth and Kaga at 17,700 feet. Their hulks stand as testimony to those 11 minutes. Recent expeditions in 2023 provided detailed surveys of these wrecks, which are now protected within the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. Survivors from both sides established memorials, and at commemorations held over the years, former enemies met as friends, united in their recognition of a battle that genuinely changed the course of history. The Japanese Navy's attempt to hide Midway's outcome from their own people, quarantining survivors and swearing them to secrecy and claiming victory publicly while hiding the defeat, just corroded morale throughout the entire fleet. It set a pattern of deception and lying about losses that would continue all the way until the war's end. Historians have endlessly debated how different those 11 minutes might have been under different circumstances. What if Tone's scout had launched on time, though modern research actually shows the delay paradoxically helped the Japanese discover the Americans earlier than they would have otherwise? What if Nagumo had kept a proper reserve strike force armed and ready? What if the American torpedo bombers hadn't sacrificed themselves drawing down the combat air patrol? What if McCluskey hadn't decided to follow that destroyer? But history doesn't have alternative timelines and parallel universes. What actually happened in those 11 minutes changed absolutely everything about the Pacific War, and possibly about the entire course of the Second World War. Modern military strategists still study Midway intensively for lessons that apply to contemporary warfare. Information dominance remains absolutely decisive in any conflict. First strike advantage in high-technology warfare almost always determines the final outcome. All military systems have specific moments of maximum vulnerability. Individual decisions made under extreme pressure still determine outcomes, even in an age of computers and networks. Better systems will defeat better warriors almost every single time. In letters and diaries and interviews that have been collected over the many decades since the battle, survivors painted incredibly intimate portraits of what those 11 minutes were actually like to experience. American and Japanese accounts converge on describing the chaos, the heroism, the absolute terror, and the fundamental transformation that occurred in those decisive moments. The analysis done by the U.S. Naval War College concludes that Midway's 11 minutes remain the absolute gold standard for decisive military action in modern warfare. Never before and never since has such a small window of time so completely reversed strategic reality on a global scale. Economic historians have calculated that those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen in 1942 currency values, which was roughly 15% of Japan's entire annual military budget. But the indirect costs were far greater than just the immediate losses. Pilot training programs had to be accelerated, which reduced the quality of new pilots. Resources got diverted from other critical projects to replace carriers. The term Midway Syndrome actually entered Japanese business vocabulary after the war, describing situations where overconfidence leads directly to catastrophic failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Raizo, writing his memoirs after the war ended, observed something profound about what those 11 minutes had taught Japan. He said those 11 minutes taught the entire nation that the age of the samurai warrior was completely over. Individual courage and skill and dedication meant absolutely nothing when facing systematic intelligence gathering, overwhelming industrial production, and technological superiority. They entered those 11 minutes as warriors and emerged as anachronisms trying to fight a modern war with an outdated mindset. Survivors from both sides carried very different but equally heavy psychological burdens for the rest of their lives. American dive bomber pilots who had delivered death in those 11 minutes often suffered from survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when so many died. Japanese sailors who lived through the infernos on those carriers faced shame in their culture for surviving when their ships had died. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb had destroyed the Akagi, never flew again because he developed tuberculosis that was activated by breathing caustic soda fumes from his aircraft's faulty oxygen system during the attack. He spent decades afterward wondering about all the men he'd killed with that one perfectly placed bomb. He said in an interview in 1995 that he'd done his duty as ordered, but that doing your duty doesn't ease the knowledge that your success meant death for hundreds of men who were also just doing their duty. Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with incredibly precise detail, revealing just how narrow the margin between victory and defeat actually was. If the American dive bombers had arrived just 5 minutes later than they did, the Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and back up at altitude where they could intercept. If the Americans had arrived 10 minutes earlier, the Japanese decks wouldn't have been completely full of aircraft yet. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower that day, the dive bombers couldn't have attacked effectively from altitude. If the wind direction had been different, the carriers couldn't have launched or recovered aircraft properly. The simulation's conclusion is stark. Those 11 minutes represented the only window in a 2-hour time period when the Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable to dive bomber attack. The Americans hit that exact window perfectly through a combination of planning, courage, and sheer luck. Military doctrine worldwide changed fundamentally based on the lessons from those 11 minutes. Carriers began operating in much more dispersed formations rather than sailing concentrated together. Combat air patrols started maintaining multiple altitude layers continuously rather than focusing at one altitude. Deck load strikes became completely standard procedure, minimizing the time aircraft spent vulnerable in hangars. Damage control capabilities became equally important as offensive capability in carrier design. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with actual combat operations. The US Navy completely rewrote their entire carrier warfare manual based on what they'd learned at Midway. The Japanese Navy understood what changes their analysis recommended, but they simply lacked the resources to actually implement those changes. They didn't have enough aircraft or fuel to maintain constant multi-layer air patrol. They couldn't afford the rapid rearmament capability their doctrine now required. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made by people under the most extreme pressure imaginable. McCluskey's decision to follow that one destroyer he spotted. Best's split-second choice of which specific target to attack. Nagumo's fateful order to rearm for land attack. Spruance's calculated risk to launch at absolute maximum range. Individual pilots pressing their attacks home despite facing certain death. Admiral Spruance reflected on this years later. He said they won because American mistakes turned out to be recoverable, while Japanese mistakes were not. In those 11 minutes, every single Japanese mistake got magnified and multiplied. Every single American gamble paid off exactly as hoped. It wasn't justice or destiny or fate. It was just probability finally catching up with accumulated risk. At the 75th anniversary commemoration of Midway, held in 2017, the last surviving participants from both sides spoke at the ceremony. Their words captured the enormous weight those 11 minutes had carried through the rest of the 20th century. History remembers those 11 minutes as representing both glory and necessary horror simultaneously. They defined not just one battle, but an entire era of warfare, proving conclusively that in modern conflict, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly in ways that would have been impossible in earlier types of warfare. They demonstrated beyond any doubt that intelligence and technology and industrial capacity matter far more than tradition and training and tactical superiority when you get right down to it. They showed that individual decisions made at absolutely crucial moments can outweigh years and years of careful preparation and planning. Between 10:20 and 10:31 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the entire trajectory of human history shifted course. 3 Japanese carriers that had been the pride of the Imperial Navy, the primary instruments of Pacific conquest, the physical symbols of Japanese military power, were transformed into burning wrecks in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The Japanese pilots who had ruled the Pacific skies for 6 solid months discovered in just 11 minutes that their dominance had been an illusion built entirely on temporary advantage that could disappear in an instant. The American pilots who had been dismissed and underestimated as inferior discovered they could destroy the world's absolute best naval force when circumstances aligned properly. In those 11 minutes, a total of 2,181 Japanese sailors and airmen would eventually die on those 4 carriers, joining 307 Americans who also died that day, all of them transforming abstract strategic concepts into concrete human tragedy. Their sacrifice, whether willing or unwilling, whether victorious or defeated, created the exact pivot point around which the entire Pacific War would turn. The carriers that sank beneath the waves took with them not just steel and fuel and ammunition, but also dreams of empire, assumptions of racial and cultural superiority, and confidence in manifest destiny. They left behind thousands of widows who would never know exactly how their husbands died, children who would grow up without fathers, and entire nations forced to confront the difference between comforting mythology and harsh reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests in the deep, nearby, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same dark, cold waters far below the surface. They remain down there as permanent monuments to those 11 minutes when the future got forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men on both sides died for causes they genuinely believed in, and when the modern world as we know it was born in violence that seemed at the time to be the end of everything. The final word, perhaps, belongs to Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived those 11 minutes only to be haunted by them for the rest of his life. Before his death on Saipan in 1944, he wrote something profound. At Midway, he said, "We learned that wars are not won by warriors, but by systems. In 11 minutes, the American system completely destroyed our warrior tradition that had existed for centuries. We thought we were fighting the previous war better than anyone else could. They were fighting the next war before anyone else even understood what that meant. Those 11 minutes were not really a battle in the traditional sense. They were an execution of obsolescence by innovation, and nothing would ever be the same again. Those 11 minutes changed far more than just the Pacific War, or even the larger global conflict. They fundamentally changed how humanity would fight wars, think about conflicts, and remember what happens when industrial age warfare meets human courage and human frailty. In those 11 minutes, the age of the individual warrior finally ended for good, and the age of the systems engineer and the technologist began in earnest. The world we live in today was born in those 11 minutes, and it has never looked back."